Welcome back. This is Dr. Jay Smith and also Mel from Sneakers Corner. It seems like the last two videos that we've just put up this week have really gone viral with over 20,000 viewings for both videos. And the one we just put on concerning who really Muhammad is, the original Muhammad, have we found him, or has Mel found him, I should say, has certainly gone quickly to the top. So because of that, we wanted to do a third follow-up video. Now, this is new material that Mel has been looking at. He's been putting it together. He's coming up with conclusions. You may not necessarily agree with all his conclusions. That's okay. That's okay. This is why we're doing this. These are what we call white papers. These are basically what-if scenarios, possible scenarios because of the evidence that we're finding. Now, remember, we've always said that we're interested in what's happening in the 7th century. We've already given up on the 9th and 10th century. We made that very clear in all of our videos. It is too late. It is too far away. Interestingly, the 9th and 10th traditions all come from Iraq. Iraq. Well, that's interesting. Okay, let's come back here again, because things were happening in Iraq. Things were going on in Iraq in the 7th century as well. And that's why Mel, as a historian, this is what all historians should do. Whenever you are introduced with material from a certain century, for heaven's sakes, go back to that century, go back to where those events happened, go back to where those events not only happened, but where the names, dates, places are coming out of. Investigate them on their own terms. Don't try to impose traditions written 200 to 300 years later onto those names, dates, and places. Try to find out what actually happened. That is the historical method, and that's what we're going to be doing, and that's what we've asked all of you to do. We've been looking at some of the comments. Mel and I are going to do some more sessions where we're going to answer your questions. Hold on. There's lots of good questions there, but many of you Muslims especially, you keep on saying, that isn't true because of so-and-so says this in Al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and Ibn Dawud and also Ibn Hisham. You keep on trying to bring us back to those traditions. We've said we're not interested in those traditions anymore. Are you getting it, Muslims? Everybody else is getting it, but you don't seem to be. We are interested in the 7th century, and we want to debunk what the Islam has been, or we want to debunk the Islam of the 9th and 10th century imposed onto the 7th century. We're going to keep reminding you of this. So let's now go back. I've invited Mel to come back. He's been so generous, and he has also been working enormously hard to get this material into one place, up so we can see it. He's got a great PowerPoint. I'm going to invite him now. Mel, are you there?
Yeah, hi Jay. Great to be back. It's hard to believe it was 3 months ago we did the last video, even though it seems like it's just come out. But yeah,
people were saying, be careful of your bicycle tour. And I kept on saying, well, wait a minute, that actually happened back in June. But he's now back at home. You're back where you're supposed to be, and you're really digging into this new material. And Mel, you now start and give us an introduction as to what you mean by the Iraqi scenario before we get into the PowerPoint.
Yeah, so the Iraqi thesis is basically a collection of different data points which all points to an origin for Islam, which is up in the Iraqi region. We saw in the first video that we did in this series where I looked at the rock inscriptions, there was a lot of evidence pointing to a kind of a pre-Islam period during the 7th century where there was an absence of Muhammad. So going into this second video that we did, what I was doing is not just saying, okay, he didn't exist, which some people misinterpreted that video. I was saying, okay, there must be a reason he's not on the rock inscriptions, because he should have been. Yeah. And a good reason would be that perhaps whatever figure the whole myth or legend of Muhammad is based on, he must have gone under another name. Because if we think back to what Robert Spencer had said, he referred to Muhammad as likely being a title, which I would agree with too. So in terms of that second video, then the whole point of that was to show that, okay, if there was a real person, let's look at the sources. What would fit the bill? So when we look at some of the earliest sources that we have, there's a number of things that is required. he has to be connected to a tribe called the Tayaye. That's one of the earliest sources. And there are also multiple sources, which I didn't even go through all of them, but there's multiple sources that contradict the Islamic tradition from the 7th century that call him a king. Now, we can dispute about what exactly they meant by king. Was he a governor? Was he just simply elected by the other Arabs? And that's where we were going with the second one. And so I looked at who was the prominent person in the right time frame. I found from multiple sources a guy called Iyas ibn Kabisha al-Tai, which means that he belonged to the Tai or Tayaye tribe. And then I just went from there, and I just looked at the different information to see whether there was multiple things pointing to an identity between him and the legend of Muhammad. And from my point of view, trying to be as objective as possible, I felt there was a really strong case that these were one and the same person. Now, there was a viewer on the channel that pointed out that this would mean that Muhammad is a Persian proxy if all of this is true. And obviously that means that if he was, that's a huge challenge to the Islamic tradition that paints him as a really patriotic Arab. There was also another viewer who also identified his son's name, which I think was Farar, as a Persian name. So that's a double kind of whammy for the Islamic tradition. But there's a little surprise in store in our presentation today that follows up on that. So even though this, my conclusions threw up the possibility that there's a Persian connection, I was able to find another source that's rarely mentioned on the internet, which also reinforces that perception of a Persian connection.
Right. Listen, why don't you go ahead and start putting up the PowerPoint? I'm just going to make sure that people understand when you say Iraqi, we're talking about the Euphrates, the Tigris, that what used to be called Mesopotamia. This is the area that is Iraq today. So when we say Iraq, we mean Iraq today. But is that area much further northeast of Mecca and Medina? This is where a lot of your great history has taken place, ancient great history. And it's between those two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, where we're now heading into. Now, remember, up until the 7th century, that was Persian. That was the Sasanian area. That was the Persian empires. Khosrau and these great kings are from that area. So just so people don't get confused. Secondly, we are getting lots of questions concerning what does this say about the Petrin, the whole Petrin narrative. We're going to be answering that, not necessarily in this lecture. We'll be doing a Q&A after this. We'll be putting up the Q&As, and we'll be taking every one of your questions, the best questions. We put together the best questions, and we will help you and unpack and show you that this does not contradict, nor does it confront the Petrin, Dan Gibson's material on the Petrin narrative. You'll see that it actually accommodates it very well and complements it quite nicely. So over to you, Mel.
Thank you, Jay. So just in terms of the title, I've called it the Iraqi thesis, but there is, as you will see, a strong Persian element to this. So I may come up with a new name for this thesis later, but for now, I think it serves its purpose. So the geographical information in the Quran is consistent with a more northerly location in the Hijaz. Let's look at one example of an internal clue from the Quran for a geographical setting. So if you can see there, Surah 74, 50 to 51 says, as though they were panicked donkeys fleeing from a lion. So if you can imagine, this is a scene that's supposedly occurring in the Hijaz. Would this scene fit there, or would it fit more appropriately with Iraq? And two possible animals that might fit this would be the Syrian wild ass and the Asiatic lion. Okay, so really the possibilities with that could be, over on the left-hand side, you see where the Jordan is, where Petra is. There is Iraq over on the right, up at the top. And then there's way down south, in the blistering heat of the Hijaz, we have Mecca. So those are the three possibilities. Now, you can see there the various Arabic words that are used in that passage. Humarum, referring to donkeys or asses, and then the Arabic word kaswara, which can refer to a lion or a beast of prey. Now, the thing is, the Asiatic lion, let me just read the bit I want, became extinct in Arabia Deserta, in other words, the Hijaz, millennia ago, thousands of years ago, but it still existed in Mesopotamia or Iraq right up to the 20th century. Now, so in terms of just that first initial clue, and you know, one of the things I would encourage the audience not to view this as an academic paper, because I want you to kind of put that aside, because there's a lot of ego around that sort of thing. I want you just to view this as the notes of a detective, where we're just examining the clues and then thinking through all the different clues, joining the dots and trying to see what the picture is, okay? Now, I am going to actually shoot myself in the foot for a moment, because yes, I could easily say this is a piece of evidence to prove that the Quran wasn't written in the Hijaz, but you know, someone could, as an objection, say, well, the person could have been writing this in the Hijaz, but talking about a visit they'd been to somewhere else. And this shows up the problem with assuming that because the locations mentioned in the Quran are in, say, Petra or Hijaz, we can't assume that that's where the Quran was written, or that's where the person associated with the beginning of Islam was from. That's a false assumption, I'm going to say. Now, so many of the locations mentioned in the Quran cluster around Petra, okay, that's a given. And I think Dan Gibson has done a fine job at demonstrating that conclusively. The focus is on Petra, that is correct, and it is romanticized, much the same as the Babylonian Jews focused on and romanticized Jerusalem. However, the locations that are mentioned in the Quran don't necessarily mean that the Quran was produced or written there.
Let me just jump in here real quickly,
yeah.
Mel. Just to give people background on this, one of the things that Dan has come up with, and the reason why Petra is so important, is because the Nabateans, that was their city of tombs and temples. That is where they buried their people. Remember, the Nabateans were traders, so they were trading all the way out to China and India. They were going all over the known world at that time. But because of the fact they didn't really have their own empire and they didn't have their own political entity, they were in and out of many people's empires. Petra then had a special focus, enormous focus above and beyond what we would consider today. Much like you say the Jews had a focus on Jerusalem, so did the Nabateans have this focus on Petra. That explains then why Petra became the focal point for all the temples that had a qibla. That means they had a direction of their prayers always towards Petra as well. Because this comes up in the question all the time: why would they need to be facing towards Petra? Why would they need to be facing to the city? Because they didn't really have a political environment there. I hope that answers that, and also supports what you're saying. These two actually accommodate each other quite well.
Yeah. So this theory is not really meant to say that Petra is wrong, and I don't want people to get the wrong idea. This is supplementary material to the Petra thesis. Obviously, some parts of the Petra thesis will have to be reworked to fit with this, perhaps, but that's all part of the process of looking at hypotheses and then moving on to theories. You know, I change my hypothesis on, you know, with every new fact I come across. So that's, you know, that's to be expected. But just to give you two parallels, Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, set mostly in Romania, while he was living in England and never set foot in Romania. The book is arguably as equally vivid there as it is in Whitby, where he had visited. So if you think about it, just because Bram Stoker even, wrote about Romania doesn't mean he wrote it in Romania. And likewise, James Joyce wrote Ulysses while living in Paris. And despite his remarkable intimate knowledge of Dublin, it was entirely from memory. And I don't know if many of your audience have read that book. It has 250,000 words, a unique vocabulary of 35,000 words. And yet you could nearly draw a map of Dublin from it. It's incredibly detailed. And yet the amazing thing is he wasn't in Dublin while he was writing this. Amazing. So the same thing could apply with the Quran. It doesn't require people to be living there, but it definitely shows a great interest in the whole Nabatean area for obvious reasons. It's close to the heart of the Arabs, being, you know, the heart of the previous Arab empire. So that, you know, there's good reasons for Petra to be the focus. So just moving on then from that, what may be more revealing is thinking about the audience, the stories referred to, and the language used. You know, I've done a little bit of writing in my past, and I'm sure many of you may have done so too. And you may remember your teacher, whenever you wrote an essay, say, think about the audience. It's all about the audience. So that's what we're going to focus on. Who is the audience? Let's think about who is the Quran talking to? Where are they? That's a key thing. What language is being used which would suit that audience? So all of these things, thinking about the language, the words used, the stories that are alluded to, all tell you a lot about the audience. So essentially this would give us a drawing, if you like, of the audience. You know, the way a detective might hear a description of a criminal and they get an artist to draw what they think the criminal would look like. He's got a big nose, he's got red hair, and he's such a height. Well, all of this evidence gives us a picture of the audience. And then if we think about where is the audience, we know where the Quran was written. So this is the logic behind my thesis. Okay, so what you will probably easily see when you read the Quran is it makes allusions to stories without retelling them. And I think, Jay, you spoke to me before that there was either no story fully told or maybe just one story. Do you remember?
You're finding, and this is what Patricia Crone came up with, that is that lots of the stories that you see in the Quran, they don't have beginnings, they don't have end, which suggests that they are borrowed and introduced knowing that the audience already knew the story. That's why you would not have to give an introduction and a conclusion. You just refer to it in passing, like we do, like you just did with Bram Stoker. You just give and you mention it. You don't give the whole story. You just talk about it. And that by doing that, that shows that the audience was familiar with it. And that's what you see all through the Quran. And many times you even give contradictory stories. If you look and see with Abraham, you can see two different stories about the Kaaba that actually contradict each other. So this is typical of qusas. These are what known as storytellers, of which the Quran is fully made up of. And that's why people haven't really looked at that, because it seems to suggest exactly what you're saying here, that there's been a retelling and a retelling, but they embellish it, or they take away, or they add to it, depending on what the need is for that audience.
I heard someone tell a story. It's kind of a funny story about a couple of criminals in a prison, and they're used to telling each other jokes, but of course they're telling the same jokes all the time. So eventually they get to the point where they don't even have to tell the joke to make the other person laugh. They just say what number the joke is. So one person says, someone says it's 2, and they all start laughing, and someone else says number 1, and they all start laughing because they remember the joke. So essentially the Quran is doing something similar.
Yeah.
So this presupposes that the original audience is familiar with the stories, and it also presupposes that these stories existed, and this is really important, in a language that the audience could understand. So if we know what language the stories were originally written in, that would suggest that the audience also spoke that language, because that's the way they would have heard the story.
Let me just interject. Let me just give you this quote from Patricia Crone herself. I've just pulled it up here, which she said in her 1987 Meccan Trade. She says, as storyteller followed upon storyteller, the recollection of the past is reduced to a common stock of stories, themes, and motifs that could be combined and recombined into a profusion of apparently factual accounts. Each combination and recombination would generate new details, and as spurious information accumulated, genuine information would be lost. In the absence of an alternative tradition, early scholars were forced to rely on the tales of storytellers, as did Ibn Ishaq, Waqidi, and other historians. It is because they relied on the same repertoire of tales that they all said much the same or similar things. So that supports what you're just saying. She found that out. She, in her studies, you're finding it out in your research.
Yeah, it's really amazing when you do research how much you see other scholars saying the same sort of thing, except they had a completely different line of research, and you discover they have come to the same conclusion. So
You come in.
that's quite reassuring. So if we look at the location of spoken Aramaic in the 7th century, this is a rough indication, I've just drawn this myself, of where you will find Aramaic in the 7th century. Now, since this time, Aramaic has been reduced in these areas because other languages have taken over, mostly Arabic. But this is.
Can you say something, Mel, here about how that Aramaic is a precursor to Arabic?
Yes, they are both Semitic languages. There is evidence to suggest that while Arabic is a sister language to Aramaic, the line of influence is from Aramaic to Arabic rather than the other way around. But there'll be more on that later. I'll hold off on that for the moment. But the key thing to note at this stage is that in the area of Iraq, which is mostly the part that's on the right-hand side, where the rivers Euphrates and the Tigris are, that's the key area of interest to us. And as you can see also, Petra is over in another Aramaic area where the Nabatean script came from. I'm going to be talking about the different dialects of Aramaic in the different areas, because that's actually another key bit of information that can allow us to go from, say, a low resolution picture, what went on, to a much higher resolution picture. But first of all, we'll look at the lower resolution picture, and then we'll zero in on more high resolution points about this. Okay. So why is this map important? So Syriac or Syro-Aramaic stories would more likely be known to those who spoke Aramaic. These Aramaic stories are merely alluded to in the Quran as if the audience doesn't need to be told them or don't need to be told them. The text is in dialogue with Syriac Christian literature, such as that concerning the 7 sleepers and the 2-horned one, Dul al-Qarnayn, in Surah 18. 70% of the Quran's foreign words are Aramaic, which shows a very close connection between the Quran and Aramaic, including some of the most important words for Islam. The Quran comes from Kiryana, which is an Aramaic word which means lectionary, and then surah and ayah. Now, the word ayah, we often translate it to mean verse, but actually in the original, it can have 2 meanings, and the primary meaning would be a sign or miracle. So that's why in some parts of the Quran, you see the Quran talking about that the ayahs will, convince you and persuade you, and they are proofs and so on. So that's what the primary meaning of it was. Now, we also find certain words that have caused a lot of confusion, like, for example, the word huri, which you find in the Quran. Now, Christoph Luxemburg first referred to this, really, and he came up with a theory which was often panned, which said that it related to grapes, and people thought, oh, that's a bit silly. But it actually relates, in terms of where you find that in the Quran, it relates to such things as Ephraim's hymns. And if you were to look at the themes in those surahs and compare it to Ephraim the Syrian, you'll find a very strong connection between the two. So this kind of helps us to see again this Aramaic connection. There is a very important word called tur, or tur, depending on how you pronounce it.
Just that last slide. I know a lot of people.
Do you want to go back a bit?
Just go one slide back again to the.
One more again?
No, that's fine. Right there, the hoodies. You're talking about the hoodie there. Go forward now, one
Oh,
slide.
the Huri, sorry. Yeah, that one. Yeah.
That one, Hootie. One of the one of the joke that's been going on is, if this is the case, if these are nothing more than pieces of grape, the
Yeah.
72 virgins that are waiting for the men in heaven will be nothing more than grapes. So you can see that this is significant as to what these women, or are these grapes waiting for them? And of course,
Yeah.
it completely changes the scenario of what heaven's going to be like for a Muslim, if depending on how you and which word you're going to look at and how you interpret it.
Yeah. Um, you know, some people out there might think, oh, that's silly. Grapes isn't much of a reward in heaven. But there is a fresco that was found in the 20th century in Egypt, so right next door to Arabia. And in it, it has the figure of Abraham, a very important figure for Arabs, feeding the souls in heaven with grapes. So this is obviously symbolic of the rewards of heaven. So for later Muslims in the 8th and 9th century to misinterpret that to mean something entirely different is kind of embarrassing when you think about it. They've failed to see the symbolic meaning, and they've gone for a literal meaning based on a misinterpretation of the word,
Or
which can
this is
happen.
intentional. This is intentional to
Or
bring more
intentional,
people
maybe.
on side, to
Yeah,
make it a much greater reward for the men who are probably questioning what's the purpose of doing all
yeah,
this.
yeah,
Why should we join Islam? Well, look what's waiting for you on the other end. So it could be
yeah.
either way, but they have taken the word, and you're right. In this case, it looks
Yeah.
like they have misinterpreted it.
But particularly at a time when the caliphs were decadent, you know, they had massive harems, and this was, you know, viewed as the ultimate thing to have, you know. So yeah, so if we look then at that word tour, it's a word which occurs in the Quran. It occurs 7 times, but it isn't an Arabic word, and it actually isn't used in Arabic even today, apart from in the Quran. It's a foreign word. Um, it is an Aramaic word, and it's not just Aramaic, as we'll see in a moment. It's actually from a particular dialect of Aramaic, which is Mandaic. In terms of the spelling, it's consistent with Mandaic Aramaic. Now, there's also some words which are Akkadian in origin, which is an ancient Babylonian language. And it is possible that they entered via Babylonian Aramaic, as Akkadian had died out centuries before. So, for example, Fahar, pottery, Furat, fresh water, and Souk, which is street, and Azawir, bracelets. So these words show up in the Quran, creating lots of problems for Muslims to try and understand what they mean. But the fact that they came into the Quran would suggest, if you look at the red circle, or well, it's not quite a circle, but you know what I mean. You'll see Babylon there, and you see where the words Tigris and Euphrates are. So that area there, all the way up to the northern Mesopotamia, going up as far as Edessa, that's the area where Akkadian had been spoken. So if those words were used, somehow that language had died out, but some of the words were retained in Aramaic in the local dialect, which was the Babylonian dialect of Aramaic. I hope that makes sense. So there isn't just one dialect across all this area. There's actually at least 4 different dialects of Aramaic around the different parts of this area. There may be more, but 4 is the ones that I've found so far. Now, the other thing is, as you can see from the tafsir, that I'm not making this up, that they didn't know what the word tour meant, and they actually had to explain it in the tafsir. Every mount is a tour, as in the Syriac and Coptic languages. So there you go. The Islamic sources are even agreeing with me that this word is a Syriac word, comes from the Aramaic. So that they had to explain it because it's not in the Arabic language. Now, so where is one example of where the word tour occurs? Surah 52:1 begins with what tour? On the mount. The problem is that the Arabic word for mountain is Jabal, for example, Jebel Musa, the mountain of Moses. But this opening part follows the style of the Babylonian or Mandaic incantation that has a long cultural history that goes all the way back to Akkadian, 1000 BC, and even Sumerian times, 4000 BC. So I'm looking at this now from an anthropological point of view. I'm thinking about where this word was used, what cultural setting was it used, and trying to see, okay, if the Quran came from Babylon or that area. Now I'm using the word Babylon just to make it clear for people. Obviously, it wasn't called Babylon in the 7th century. It was called that in earlier times. But the word tour has been found on Mandaic Aramaic incantations. These are spells essentially that were drawn on pottery, and people have found lots of examples of these. Now, I'll just give you one example. The ancient Mesopotamian incantation series, Sherpu, says the following: my illness, my weariness, my guilt, my crime, my sin, my transgression, the illness that is present in my body, my flesh and my veins, be peeled off like this garlic, so that the fire god, the burner, consumes it today. May the curse leave, so that I may see the light. Now, there was a strong culture going, if you can imagine this, going back 5,000 years in that whole area of casting spells, and spells were used defensively and offensively. So if you had an enemy, you cast a spell on them. If you wanted to protect yourself against other people's spells, you would create another spell as a defensive line. And this is like Harry Potter stuff, but the evidence suggests that this was still a strong part of the culture in that area at the time of the 7th century. So it's important that we bear that in mind. Now, here's an example of Babylonian Aramaic incantation. It's an incantation bold written in the Aramaic language. It comes from that area of Babylon, which is Mesopotamia. It's dated somewhere between the 4th and 7th century, and it's in the Bergamo Museum in Berlin. And if we analyze the surah, we actually, at least according to me, I haven't heard anyone else say this, but based on what I know from the cultural background, this is my interpretation. So I may be wrong, but it seems to me that this is a fair interpretation. So when a person casts a spell, what they do is they call on the powers of nature. And so they refer to different objects around them, and they basically take the powers of nature to those objects, if you like. And then once they've gathered all of these occult powers, they project it in a curse towards whatever it is they want to direct it towards. And they spell out, pardon the pun, what they want to happen to the person, okay? So you can see there, by the Mount Tour, and a book inscribed in a published scroll, and the frequented house, and the elevated roof, and the seething sea. So this surah is often be depicted as more poetic than other parts, but there is a reason behind it. I would suggest that it's part of a magical formula. The punishment of your Lord is coming. There is nothing to avert it. On the day when the heaven sways in agitation, and the mountains go in motion, woe on that day to the deniers, those who pay with speculation, the day when they were shoved into the fire of hell forcefully. This is the fire which you used to deny. And then it says, interestingly, is this magic, or do you not see? So that's my suggestion on what it means. Now, there is an obvious objection. This is ridiculous spell. You know, there are no spells in the Quran. Muslims don't cast spells, do they? They don't curse each other. Well, 3 days after I prepared this PowerPoint, I saw a very interesting tweet from someone who you might have heard of. Have you ever heard of Ali Dawah? Ali Dawah, as if to prove my point, said the following. I'm just moving these videos on my way. So
for those of you who don't know who we're talking about, Ali Dawah is a very well-known, he's a protagonist from Speaker's Corner there in London. Actually, we've had lots of contact with him over the years, and he is right now, as we're speaking, in a real confrontation with David Wood and apostate prophet, along with Muhammad Hijab. So the four of them are, and this is where this tweet comes from, I'm assuming, because it's August 24th. Am I correct?
Yeah. Yep. So literally just a few days ago. So this is what he says. Every Muslim should say Ameen and retweet this. May Allah cause a disease or an illness to inflict those individuals who have desecrated the Quran. May it be so severe that they never forget till the day they die and in the hereafter. Ameen. Remember this tweet. So after sharing my information about the incantations, what I discovered from lots of viewers on my channel, that actually there are loads and loads and loads of references in the Islamic traditions to the use of spells and incantations. And, you know, I find it quite disturbing. I don't know about you, but in the Christian tradition, we're encouraged to bless everyone, not to curse people. Yes,
Cursing
you
is
find,
only for God. You're right, and only He can curse. We are not permitted to curse, and that's
yeah,
why it's very clear that we have a completely different paradigm. And that's why when we see things like this, we we find it as not only symptomatic of that worldview, it's also symptomatic of their scriptures and symptomatic, as you're saying, of that which has been going on in that part of the world for some centuries.
yeah. So could the early story of the Quran reflect possibly differences over Aramaic dialects long since hushed up? So now we're going to look at this issue of different dialects. Now, if we look at volume 6, book 61, number 510, this is one that you often refer to, Jay. Hudayfa bin al-Yaman came to Uthman. Hudayfa was afraid of the people of Sham and Iraq's differences in the recitation of the Quran. Okay, so there's a problem between the people of Sham, which is Syria, and those of Iraq in terms of the recitation of the Quran. It doesn't say exactly why, but Al-Bukhari says, again, we just focus on that line again, Hudayfa was afraid of the people of Sham and Iraq, differences in the recitation of the Quran. So if we analyze it from the point of view of Aramaic, it makes perfect sense. There are two separate dialects that we can identify and verify. So this is not just wild goose chase, or just me just coming up with a mad idea here. We can verifiably say that there are two separate dialects in these regions, one Syro-Aramaic and one Babylonian Aramaic. Okay, now, so if we look at that text again in light of that, it starts to make sense in a way that it wouldn't otherwise. Why did the people of Shams and Iraq have differences in the recitations of the Quran? It doesn't say what language these recitations were in. It is just assumed it must be Arabic through the eyes of the 9th century. And notice the following. Uthman sent a message to Haifa saying, send us the manuscripts of the Quran so that we may compile the Quranic materials in perfect copies and return the manuscripts to you. Now, it is assumed that the people of Shams and Iraq had bad copies of the original, i.e. there were scribal errors in the text, but they could have been in two different dialects. What would stop it from happening again? Like, scribal errors happened the first time. If that's true, then they could happen again. But the other possibility is that the reason for this is that they were in separate dialects and there needs to be conformity between these two dialects. Now, the problem there is that if you choose one dialect over another, there's going to be one group of people that won't fully understand the text, whereas the other group will. So that's the problem. And essentially then it becomes a power struggle. Who has got more sway, the Syrians or the Iraqis? If we assume that I'm correct in terms of my interpretation. See, I believe that before the Quran was in Arabic, there was an original set of documents which were in Aramaic, perhaps in different forms of Aramaic. And this is the background to my thinking, if people don't follow me.
Can I just interject real quickly here? Muslims will come back to you on this and say, no, you're getting it wrong on this, Mel. This has nothing to do with the fact that there is a competition between two dialects up in the north. This had more to do with the fact that the Qurayshi dialect, I know you're going to get into this, the Qurayshi dialect, which is unique to the Hijaz, the central part of Arabia, is the true dialect. This is the one that Muhammad spoke, therefore this is the one that the Quran was initially revealed to in. And this is the one that would exist in heaven. That's a whole nother story. We're not getting into that. And that's why Hudayfa, when he comes and returns back down to Medina and says to Uthman, what are we going to do? We do not want to have the many different Qurans like the Christians and Jews. We must bring it back to one Quran, the original Quran, the Qurayshi Quran. And that's why then Uthman then turns around and burns those others from Shams and Iraq after he gets this final Qurayshi dialect, or the Qurayshi Quran, and sends it to 5 cities. Look at 3 of those cities are in Iraq, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Syria, sorry. So you can see that by doing that, he is what Muslims will say, and I know you're going to answer this, but the Muslims will say this has nothing to do with the competition of those northern dialects. It's the eradication of those northern dialects because of the fact that Qurayshi is the standard that is in heaven, and there's also that what Muhammad would have spoken.
Yeah. So I'm going to suggest there, on this point, there's not just a hole in the Islamic tradition. There's a Grand Canyon in the Islamic tradition, and I'm going to drive a stagecoach and horses right through it now. There is no tribe called Quraysh that I could find in the 7th century.
I love this. This is why it's so good. Good on you. Very good.
There is clear evidence that the tribe that Muhammad belonged to was the Tayyaye. That's their earliest sources. There is no earlier than that. So our very first mention in the 7th century clearly says the Tayyaye of Muhammad. You can't get around that. So this 8th and 9th century myth of a Quraysh tribe that Muhammad belongs to is wrong. And I'm going to show you how that mistake, which probably was partly accidental, partly on purpose, but I'm going to show you why this mistake entered the Islamic tradition and where it came from. Now, it does require a little bit of devilment in terms of linguistics and a lot of playing around with letters, which is not something that is beyond the possibility of the Islamic tradition to do, because as we can see in lots of different examples, there is a lot of covering up and changing and editing and deleting and so on. And this is just another example of a long, long list of manipulation going on since the 7th century. So without further ado, Hafsa sent it to Uthman. Uthman then ordered Zaid bin Thabit, Abdullah bin Azubair, Saeed bin Alas, and Abdur Rahman bin Harith bin Hisham to write the manuscripts in perfect copies. Uthman said to the 3 Qurayshi men, in case you disagree with Zaid bin Thabit on any point in the Quran, then write it in the dialect of Quraysh. The Quran was revealed in their tongue. Okay, now, here's the problem. This is the hole in the Islamic narrative that I want to point out. The dispute is between Syria and Iraq. So we have 2 sides here. Zaid bin Thabit, he represents one side, and then on the other side, there are 3 people who represent the side of the Quraysh. Now, just looking at it objectively, just in terms of the plain meaning and context, you'd have to say that one of them represents the Syrian side in the dispute, and the other 3 represents the Iraqi side. That makes logical sense. Now, if we go further and think about that word Quraysh, it actually comes up with an answer. You see, the Jews referred themselves, the Jews are sometimes referred to as the sons of Israel, Bani Israeli, or Bani Israel, but they refer to Iraqis as Bani Quraysh. So when Uthman said to the 3 Qurayshi men, in case you disagree with Zaid bin Thabit on any point in the Quran, then write it in the dialect of Quraysh. The Quran was revealed in their tongue. I believe that the Qurayshi dialect refers to the Babylonian dialect found at that time in Iraq. Therefore, Abdullah bin Azubair, Saeed bin Alas, and Abdur Rahman bin Harith bin Hisham were Iraqi. They were not from the Hijaz, as later thought. And I know there are going to be people, particularly the linguists, who will say, yeah, but that's a K and we're dealing with a Q and so on. Yes, it does sound like it, but it's a different letter. So, you know.
Let me just say this real quickly. Yeah. For people who jump you on that, how do you spell the word Quran today? Koran or Qur''an? Are not both correct?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So this is a non-argument whether it's K or Q. It's linguistically how you hear it, how you sound, how you say it. We used to always say all the time whenever I talked about you must keep to the 3 C's: quick, concise, yet comprehensive. Well, okay, so there's a Q in there, but it sounds like a C. So we even do that in English. So that would be a non-argument as far as we're concerned.
Yeah. So the Quraysh is written in this letter in the Arabic, and those of you who are Arabic speakers will be able to tell me what it is. I've forgotten, and I didn't get a chance to just remind myself. And Cyrus is written with this letter in Hebrew. So when it says Koresh, the original meaning is it refers to Cyrus. So the Iraqis were referred to the sons of Cyrus. Cyrus being a very famous person from centuries before, but the Jews considered him to be a very noble person, one of their heroes. If you look in the Old Testament and look up Cyrus, you'll see the Jews love Cyrus. He's one of the honorable, just people who allowed the Jews to return from exile in Babylonia. So obviously that makes sense that the Jews would call the Iraqis Bani Koresh. So I just think what happened somewhere along the line, they hid the connection by just changing the letter. Remember, we're jumping between different dialects, different scripts. There's lots of ways in which this would happen. The linguists among us will probably say, I'm breaking all the rules here. It doesn't work like that. But I'm not entirely convinced that the people who were writing these things were completely honest at all times. There may have been a certain manipulation of the text, perhaps, that has hit it. But in any case, that's what I think had happened. So the idea that the Koresh was connected to Iraq became forgotten as a new Islamic narrative came in to fill the holes. Now, here's another thing. I'm suggesting that there was some material that was used for the Quran and that it was originally in Aramaic. Now, the book is in Arabic now. I've never picked up a French book or a German book and read in the book, hey, this is in German, this is in French. It should be obvious. It's kind of as obvious as me saying, hey, I'm Irish. You know, if you've heard my accent, you would know it. But for the Quran to say, hey, I'm in Arabic and do it 10 times is a bit peculiar. And whenever I see something peculiar, that makes me investigate a little bit deeper. So as you can see here in the examples, it keeps saying over and over, it's in a clear Arabic language. This book is a confirmation in the Arabic tongue. If we had made it in a non-Arabic Quran, they would have said. Do you notice this is the other side of an argument? If someone is saying is, if we did this, then blah, 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 what they're really saying is, you're accusing us of making it in a non-Arabic language, and then they're trying to justify why it is in Arabic. So even just looking at the text, it's hinting that there was something before it connected to another language. Now, one objection might be, well, yes, there's a few foreign words in the Quran, and that would explain why it keeps saying, no, this is in the Arab tongue, but maybe there's more to it. Maybe it originally was in a different language, and the people at the time that the Quran was written are dealing with people saying that this is silly. We know it was in Aramaic before, so they have to try and defend the book against those accusations. So as I said, the Quran affirms 10 times that it is in Arabic, but in the Arabic itself, the word that's used is Arabiya. The Arabiya tongue can simply mean the Western dialect, if we look at its Aramaic meaning. The Aramaic word Arabiya means Western. Mandaic is a dialect of Aramaic typically found in Persia, which was closely related to Babylonian Aramaic and could easily be confused with it. Hence the likely need to reiterate, no, this is written in the Western Aramaic dialect, not the Eastern. Boo hiss, you know. Mandaic Aramaic was spoken and still is spoken in Kazakhstan in Iran. Gabriel Salma claims that the word in Arabic is actually a mistake in punctuation, and it is actually, as you can see the word there, it means foreign or west of Mesopotamia. So that literally there's only a dot in the difference. So he would suggest that originally what was there wasn't the word Arabic, but actually it referred to the Arabic tongue, which when we say tongue rather than language, what we were talking about is the dialect. So it's saying this Quran is written in the Western dialect, not the Eastern dialect. That's essentially what people like Gabriel Salma has said. Now, if we looked at it in the context of a map, Mandaic Aramaic is there. Now, it also existed in other parts as well, but that's where it came from. Bear in mind that people were nomads as well as settled. So, dialects moved around with tribes and so on, but mostly it was in that region there. As you can see, Mandaic is in the eastern part, Babylonian is in the western part. So if we assume that the Quran was written somewhere in Iraq, and it has maybe some words in Mandaic, Aramaic, perhaps they were borrowed, people might have said, oh, is this Mandaic Aramaic or is this Babylonian Aramaic? And the writer of the Quran or writers are saying, no, 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 this is Western Aramaic. Now,
Mel, I'm going to jump in here at this time. I see now that we're coming up to an hour or just a little over an hour, and we really want to make this into two different segments. So what I'm going to suggest is we wrap this up, this section up, this first section up, and try to give an overview of what you've just said. And then in the next episode, what we're going to do is then move on from there and look at the audience of the Quran. Who is the people exactly, and why is it significant when we look at the Mesopotamian area, this area in the eastern and northeastern area of the Tigris and Euphrates? Who are these people that the Quran's speaking to, and why is that significant when we unpack the Quran today? So let's do a quick overview of what we've already done, because you've done something I think that's unique, and you've done something that I don't think anybody else has really done before. What you've done is you said, let's go back to the Quran and let's look and see what languages it's been used. And you started out by looking at the Asiatic lion in chapter 74, verse 50 to 51. And you said, if you look at this Asiatic lion, you notice that there is no lions in the Hijaz part of Arabia, in Mecca, Medina. They just don't exist. But they do exist up in Iraq. They do exist in the Euphrates Valley. In Iraq, we're talking about the Mesopotamia. We're talking about that area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is where the civilization has been growing for centuries. This is the center of many of the archaic dynasties and civilizations. And so it stands to reason then that we need to look at that area. And then you go on and continue to say that when you look at the Quran, you will see that almost much of the Quran fits that area in Iraq, not Arabia, not the Hijaz. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that the authors have to have lived in that area. I mean, you did bring up this supposition that someone could have been living in Medina and have traveled and seen Asiatic lions. True, that's understandable. But you're going to get in much more depth than that by showing, yes, but let's don't just look at lions. Let's look at some other, and let's look and see where that Arabic came from. The language itself comes from the Aramaic. And you talk about Aramaic is the kingpin. Why do you say that? Well, take a look at the foreign words in the Quran, and you say that 70% of the foreign words are Aramaic. Now that should ring a bell right there, and that should really get people's attention. If 70% of the words are Aramaic, then that suggests to me, and I'm hearing what you're saying, that should suggest to anybody listening, that good bit of the audience, the good bit of the language that was used, a good bit of the Quran when it was first written down was probably written in that language, and that still retains those words today. You gave it two examples, especially one of the Houris, that are in especially chapter 55 and chapter 56 of the Quran, these women who are there to wait upon the men in heaven. And then you say, hold on, but in the Aramaic, you referred to Luxemburg's thesis on this. In the Aramaic, this word actually means grapes. If that is the case, then those later traditions that now take and unpack the Quran and comment on the Quran have introduced this idea that it is women, these virgins, perpetual virgins, where in reality, what's waiting for those who die and go to heaven are these grapes. And you gave the great example antecedent to that with Abraham holding the grapes. And you also refer to chapter 52, verse 1, and the word Tur, which are the mountains. But that's an Aramaic word. Jabal is the word in Arabic. It has become such a problem that even the commentators in the 10th century, remember in the 10th century now, we're talking about Al-Tabari and others, they have to explain what Tur means because it's a foreign word that makes no sense. And why? Because this word is actually a Coptic word. This word is an Aramaic word. This word is from those in the 7th century. Again, which supports the notion that the Quran itself is talking to that language, is written in that language, and not what the later traditions want to impose on them at the Arabic. And then I love what you do is you go to Al-Bukhari, one of our favorites. Of course, it's the only place you can go to find out how the Quran was written. It's the only place that Muslims could go to find out how the Quran is written. And you go to volume 6, Hadith number 509 and 510. We've referred to it quite a bit, but what I love is how you unpacked it. You unpack a lot of different than I've ever unpacked it. I've always assumed that this whole conflict that's going on at the time of Uthman in 652 is because those Iraqis and those Syrians, those naughty Iraqis and Syrians, do not agree with the Qurayshi dialect. And that's what the whole conflict is about. And that's what Dr. Shabarani's been talking about. That's what all the Muslims are saying. This is nothing more than trying to bring the Quran into that great Qurayshi dialect. That's the Qurayshi dialect that exists in heaven. That's the Qurayshi dialect that was revealed to Muhammad. That's the Qurayshi dialect that Uthman spoke. And that's the Qurayshi dialect that Zayd ibn Thabit, along with the three others, all who spoke Qurayshi dialect, that's what they're supposed to write it in. But then you brought up a really interesting point. Hold on a minute. Why would there be conflict? Why would there be any disagreement? If you have any disagreement, write it in the Qurayshi dialect. What Qurayshi dialect you're saying? Now, this is lovely. This is why I love what you do, Mel. You love to work with many different things. You're not only looking at places and events, you're also looking at language. And the language you're looking here, you're looking at that word Qurayshi, and you're saying this could also be the Banu Qurayshi. The Banu Qurayshi are
what the Jews called the people of Iraq. So it's the Jewish term for the people of Iraq.
There you go. So that's Iraq again, replacing it back again. So this is fascinating. If this is the case, then you can see exactly that the language now supports the environment, which supports the place and supports the time. The time is right, because at this time in the 7th century, they would still be up in Iraq. We haven't yet, remember, we haven't yet found out about Mecca. Mecca is not even found until 727. That's another 100 years later. We don't know of any place called Mecca. There is no mosque facing Mecca at all until 727. The first recording, the first record of Mecca, the word itself, is not till 741. That's well over 100 years later. So this would make sense that this Qurayshi, if this Qurayshi word is a word that existed in the Hijaz, then why is it we don't see reference to it? There's no reference to it at all. But it looks like it's a deformation of what they're referring to, the people they're referring to. Again, in the Euphrates, the people who are from Iraq, by the Jews. This has been terrific. So now we're showing that the language is much further north. The language, even the words, even the internal references, 70% of the internal references in the Quran do not fit the Hijaz, do not fit Mecca, Medina. They fit much further north, in this case, the Mesopotamian area, the Euphrates Valley, the Tigris in the Euphrates Valley, where what, as you've been saying, Muhammad actually comes from what the previous episode. Good. We're going to end it there. This has been terrific, Mel. Thanks for coming on board. I just love the way you think. I love the way you research, and I love the fact that you're bringing up stuff that's actually bringing it all down to the same narrative, and that is, folks, when you look at history, history tells us a different story than what the traditions are. Be careful of the traditions. They're written too late by people who don't know what happened, did not look at history, did not go to where the events happened, did not even go to, in this case, to the language, didn't understand the language, nor these words. Make sure you always, when the claims you make, that you can support it and source it. Mel has done that today. God bless you. Thanks for coming on board, Mel. Can't wait for the next episode. They'll be coming up next. This is Jay and Mel. Over and out.